By 2030, 150,000 children in the UK will be homeless and living in B&Bs and other emergency accommodation. That's according to new research from the National Housing Federation. And 1.5 million families will be on the council house waiting list. That's been predicted, an increase of more than a third.
So no surprise, perhaps, that Britain is being declared to be in the middle of a housing emergency, according to a leading housing association, a theme that we did hear, of course, in Keir Starmer's speech in the Labour conference in Liverpool. Let's get more with our economics and business editor, Liam Halligan, with On the Money.
On this Bedfordshire building site, dreams are being made of a safe and permanent home. This project is led by Grand Union, a not-for-profit housing association. They're building 40 social housing units here for low-income and vulnerable families, paying below market rents. But with over 1 million households on the council house waiting list, these much-needed homes barely scratch the surface.
I think when we have 150,000 children sleeping in temporary accommodation, and it's not really temporary because some of it has lasted over 10 years, then that is an emergency. We're damaging people's futures.
This Kerry's photo.
For Ian and Cheryl Jarvis, social housing became their only option when their daughter Keris was diagnosed with hydrocephalus. Keris, unable to walk or talk, life in a 7th floor flat became impossible for this close-knit family.
We were paying over the odds for privately renting. So even though we had 2 wages at the time, once Keris came along, the wages started to dwindle because we were needing to be more out of work. So then you
to look after
the daughter because she was always in hospital visits.
Yeah.
So it just became too expensive. Then if we'd have carried on trying to be in the private side, we would have been probably worse off than we were. We'd been flat on our faces.
By 2030, the National Housing Federation estimates 1.5 million low-income and vulnerable households will be on the waiting list for affordable social housing. That's a third more than today. As a result, 150,000 children will be living in temporary accommodation, such as bed and breakfasts and emergency hostels. That's 6 children in every school in the country.
We can't shower any other
For Ian and Cheryl, given Keris's special needs, Grand Union has been a lifesaver.
I dread to think where we would be, if we'd be together or separated, if enabled to be living with our daughter, because she needs a lot of equipment and she needs a 24-hour care. I don't know where we'd be without Grand Union and being in this house.
Elsewhere in Bedfordshire is Grand Union's newly built Chamomile Gardens, sheltered accommodation for social tenants aged 55 plus. Jackie recently lost her leg in an accident. She says living here is a godsend, but social housing is a lottery.
There seems to be an area where some people are struggling to get anywhere and others just seem to be lucky. I don't know how other way to explain it.
With the media focused on home ownership, Aileen Evans says the need for more social housing is often ignored. But the alternative is the state subsidising vulnerable families to rent on the open market.
Successive governments need to invest in social housing. Otherwise, we will consign families to lives where their futures are stolen, and we'll have a burgeoning housing benefit bill that will cost the taxpayer far more than building social housing in the first place.
While Rishi Sunak failed to mention housing in his party conference speech, Keir Starmer put more homes at the centre of his offer to voters. This could be the issue that decides the next general election. Liam Halligan, GB News, in Bedfordshire.
Well, Liam Halligan joins us now. Liam, Rishi Sunak, you just mentioned him there in your package. He didn't make a big thing about the housing crisis, did he, in his speech?
He didn't mention housing once in his speech, and I think that was a huge miss on his part. Keir Starmer, in contrast, put housing at the very centre of his speech. But again, it was mainly housing geared towards owner occupancy, young professionals who want to buy homes, rather than social housing, which I think is a real Cinderella of public policy, because this is the sharp end. This is where you have low-income and vulnerable households just getting a roof over their heads at an affordable rent. Of course, you've got council housing, which is below market rent, and then you've got housing association housing provided by non-for-profit organisations, and that's what I featured in that package. But over the last 40 years, Pip and Mark, there have only been 3 years when we've actually built more social housing than we've demolished or sold.
Yeah.
So the stock of social housing is falling all the time. The council waiting list is getting longer and longer and longer, so people end up in temporary accommodation.
And of course we did have the situation, Margaret Thatcher making council housing available to buy, and people, you know, for understandable reasons, filled their boots with that and bought their own homes. But that was the start, really, of that huge reduction in what we used to call council housing stock.
Yeah, but Margaret Thatcher's government still built a lot more council houses each year than
we do at the moment,
the Blair Brown era in 10 years and the Tories from 2010 onwards. That we've hardly built any of these homes because the Treasury seems to have got it into its head that it's better to put social tenants in private accommodation and then pay their rent for them.
Yeah.
But we've ended up in a situation where we're spending £25 billion a year on housing benefit to pay for that, and often these private social homes, if you like, the landlords don't particularly look after the tenants have got nowhere to go, and you end up, look, I mean, we've just had announced yesterday serious failings or delay in social housing landlords. The Housing Ombudsman Service has reported that last year they quadrupled hundreds of families who are in accommodation where their health has been impacted.
Yeah, and we see these reports about mould
it's
and things
Dickensian.
like that, yeah.
But if you live in a council house, it's your house for the rest of your life, it's far more likely that you can maintain it yourself or you can do some of the work yourself. Of course, the council will often help you. But this model of just paying for people to live in private sector accommodation just isn't working.
Where are we going to be then in, say, 10 years' time if we don't get to grips with this?
Well, the National Housing Federation, which is the housing association's sort of umbrella organisation, they're saying the council house waiting list will go up by a third. But I think further down the line, because we've got, you know, so many 40 and 50-year-olds now, let alone 30-year-olds, who don't own their own home. And when they stop working, they won't be able to pay rent. So then they're going to need some kind of state-sponsored accommodation. This is the kind of tsunami of demand coming down the line. And that's why in my writing and broadcasting for many, many years, and in my book, Home Truth, I say, look, we just have to build more social housing, more council housing.
Is the other problem that the house builders, and you know, there are not many smaller firms now or family firms,
as we've discussed,
they just want to build executive homes because that's where the profit is.
They do, but they would build council housing if the incentive was there. The state says it isn't building council housing because the land's so expensive. But then I say to that, but the state owns 6% of all freehold land in the country, many of it in urban areas.
This is what they call grey land, according to Labour at the
many of it. Well, no, that's something different.
Right,
grey land is between Greenbelt and Brownfield.
Right.
So no, this is something completely different. This is land that the state owns, but the Treasury again, they're often a roadblock in this. They've been very reluctant to release that land for housing, even if it is council housing, which in the end would save money, because you save money if the state owns the house and houses the social tenant rather than paying rent to a landlord every year.
And what's also important is to make sure these houses are equipped properly for people who aren't able-bodied.
Sure.
So many of them aren't.
Sure. I mean, of course that's important, but that's just the cherry on top of the cake. I mean, we've got so many households in temporary accommodation now, or in bad private sector accommodation. It strikes me that we just need to build more council houses and housing associations. You talked about the right to buy there, Mark. The irony of that is, yes, quite a few council houses were sold off in the 80s and into the 90s. But the legislation actually said for every home that was sold, another one had to be built. But that legislation just fell by the wayside, and no council was ever prosecuted, and that was the problem. So we've diminished our stock of social housing.